They found out something about you that they were never supposed to misunderstand, and the moment that truth reached them, the story they had been telling themselves began to fall apart. This Six of Wands reversed is the symbol driving this message. Psychologically, it speaks about recognition that was delayed, praise that was withheld, and a person whose pride prevented them from admitting what they could feel. It is not predicting an outcome. It is showing the emotional pattern underneath this connection, okay? For a long time, this person may have acted as though you were not important, as though your care was ordinary, or as though they could walk away without feeling the absence. But that image was never honest. It was easier for them to appear unaffected than to admit that you had reached a part of them they could not control. And here is where it gets interesting. Something recently challenged their version of events. A conversation, a detail, your silence, or the way somebody else contradicted themselves may have forced them to look again. They are beginning to understand that what they called distance may have been self-protection. What they called indifference may have been exhaustion. What they interpreted as rejection may have been you refusing to keep proving your worth. You did not become guarded for no reason. You became guarded after being left to decode mixed signals, carry unanswered questions, and act strong while wondering why honesty seemed so difficult for them. The reversed Six of Wands also reflects wounded pride. This person wanted to control how the connection was remembered. They may have needed to believe that they were the one who mattered less, cared less, or moved on first. But now that belief is cracking, and they have not admitted the most uncomfortable part. They are realizing that while they were waiting for you to chase them, you were quietly learning how to live without their approval. That change in you is what has made the truth impossible for them to ignore. But what they discovered next goes much deeper than pride. They are beginning to understand that your withdrawal was not designed to punish them. It was not a strategy to make them panic, compete, or come running back with the attention you had been asking for all along. You became quiet because you were tired. This Five of Cups reversed reflects that emotional turning point. Psychologically, it represents the moment when grief stops controlling every decision and a person begins recovering what disappointment took from them. You were not trying to create regret in someone else. You were trying to stop living inside your own. And that changes everything. Because this person may have believed your patience meant you would always remain available. Every time you forgave the inconsistency, tried to understand the silence, or gave them another opportunity to speak honestly, they treated your emotional endurance like proof that there would never be consequences. They did not recognize those moments as chances. They recognized them as guarantees, but you had already been giving more than they understood. You gave them room when they were overwhelmed. You softened conversations that could have become confrontations. You tried to read what they could not say, and sometimes you accepted partial answers because you hoped safety would eventually make them more honest. That was not weakness. That was care. The uncomfortable realization is that they confused your compassion with an inability to leave. They assumed that because you understood their fears, you would continue absorbing the effects of those fears. But Understanding why somebody behaves a certain way does not remove the pain their behavior creates. And eventually, you reach the point where protecting the connection required abandoning yourself. So you stopped. Not because your feelings disappeared overnight, but because you could no longer keep turning your disappointment into patience just to make the situation easier for them. The Five of Cups reversed shows the emotional pattern of looking up after loss and recognizing that something still remains. For you, what remained was your dignity, your clarity, and the part of you that remembered love should not require constant interpretation. But there is another layer. This person did not arrive at this understanding through private reflection alone. Something exposed the difference between what they had been saying about you and what was actually true. A detail surfaced. Someone remembered the story differently. Or a contradiction became too obvious for them to explain away. And once they saw it, they could not return to the version that protected them, because the contradiction may have come from something small enough to seem harmless at first. A mutual person may have described you as patient, loyal, or far more affected than you ever allowed people to see. An old message may have been brought back into context. Or this person may have witnessed somebody else receiving the kind of care you once gave them and suddenly understood how rare it actually was. This Knight of Wands reversed reflects the instability underneath that realization. Psychologically, it speaks about impulsive reactions, inconsistent effort, and a person who moves quickly when emotion becomes uncomfortable but struggles to remain present long enough to understand what is happening. They may have judged your response while ignoring what provoked it, and now the details are becoming harder to separate. A moment they once called dramatic may look more like the final result of repeated disappointment. A question they dismissed as pressure may now sound like a reasonable request for clarity. Even your silence may feel different when they remember how many conversations you attempted before you stopped speaking. This is not really about somebody exposing a secret. It is about information reaching them without the protection of their usual interpretation. For once, they may have heard your side without being able to interrupt it, defend themselves, or reshape it around what they wanted to believe. And that is where the old story begins collapsing. Because once one memory changes meaning, the others do not remain untouched. They start remembering your tone, the timing, the way you kept trying to make space for honesty without forcing it. They may even recognize that what they called inconsistency in you was often a response to inconsistency from them. The reversed Knight of Wands also shows the pattern of entering intensely and retreating just as quickly. This person may have expected you to understand every disappearance, every change in energy, and every unfinished conversation while offering you very little stability in return. But the comparison exposed something. Your intentions were steadier than their interpretation of them. You were not trying to trap them. You were trying to understand whether they were truly present. And when they could not answer that clearly, fear and pride filled in the blanks for them. But the most painful realization is not simply that they misread you. It is that some part of them needed you to be wrong. Because accepting your sincerity would have forced them to examine what they did with it. This Seven of Pentacles reversed reflects the discomfort of looking at an investment and realizing that impatience, neglect, or inconsistent effort affected the result. Psychologically, it speaks about someone questioning what they expected to receive while avoiding an honest look at what they were willing to contribute. It may have felt safer for them to call you demanding than to admit that you were asking for basic consistency. Safer to describe you as distant than to acknowledge how often they made closeness feel uncertain. Safer to say you changed without considering how long you had been adapting to behavior that never gave you anything stable to trust. And here is the part they may not have wanted to face. If your intentions were sincere, then they were responsible for how they responded to them. They could no longer blame the entire breakdown on timing, confusion, or your reaction. They would have to recognize the moments when you asked for honesty and received avoidance. The moments when you tried to repair something and were met with silence. The moments when you needed reassurance, but somehow ended up reassuring them instead. Understanding why they protected themselves does not erase what that protection cost you. You were still left carrying questions they helped create. You were still expected to make sense of contradictions they refused to explain. And while they preserved an easier version of themselves, you were left wondering whether your needs had somehow become the problem. They were not the problem. The lack of mutual responsibility was. The reversed Seven of Pentacles also shows frustration with delayed results. This person may have wanted the closeness, loyalty, or emotional security you offered without accepting the patience and consistency required to build it. And when the connection stopped producing comfort for them, they may have judged the outcome instead of examining their effort. But now that judgment is turning into shame. Not only because they were wrong about you, but because they may have repeated that version to somebody else. They may have allowed other people to see you through the distortion that protected their pride. They may have spoken as though you were difficult while leaving out everything that made you guarded. And the truth is beginning to change that too. They are no longer as comfortable defending the position they once took. So their behavior may be changing before their words do. This Seven of Cups reflects the confusion that appears when too many versions of a story can no longer exist comfortably at the same time. Psychologically, it speaks about competing interpretations, imagined possibilities, and the difficulty of choosing truth when illusion has protected someone for so long. They may become quieter when your name is mentioned, not because they suddenly know exactly what to say, but because repeating the old version now feels dishonest. They may correct a small detail they once allowed somebody else to misunderstand. They may refuse to laugh at a comment that reduces what happened between you. Or they may listen differently when another person describes your character. These changes can be subtle. A pause where there used to be certainty. A softer explanation. A moment of discomfort when somebody repeats the same judgment they once encouraged, and none of this means they have fully admitted everything. It means the position they took is becoming harder to maintain. The reversed Six of Wands returns here as a loss of control over recognition. This person may have wanted to decide who received sympathy, who appeared unaffected, and whose version of the connection became accepted. But truth has a way of creating pressure without asking for permission. You may never have demanded public vindication. You may not have tried to expose them, correct every misunderstanding, or convince people to see you differently. You may have decided that constantly defending your intentions would only keep you connected to a story you were trying to leave. But your silence did not make their version more true. It only gave them more time to believe it. Now, the Seven of Cups places them in front of every explanation they used. They can preserve the image that once protected their pride, or they can acknowledge that your behavior made sense within the reality they kept leaving out. And that choice is becoming urgent. Because while they have been revisiting the past, they have also been watching the present. They are noticing that your energy is no longer organized around whether they understand you. Your attention appears more protected. Your reactions are calmer. Even the way you carry yourself may suggest that something inside you has moved forward. And for the first time, they are beginning to wonder whether your emotional world still has a place waiting for them. And that question is not necessarily about another person. It may be about the possibility that you have become unavailable to the pattern itself. This Four of Swords reversed reflects the anxiety that appears when a period of silence no longer feels temporary. Psychologically, it speaks about restlessness, delayed processing, and the moment someone realizes they cannot keep avoiding what has been waiting for their attention. Your calm may be affecting them more than your anger ever did. Anger would still show them where your attention was focused. An argument would still give them access to your emotions. Even frustration could reassure them that the connection still had enough influence to pull you out of yourself. But this is different. You may not explain your boundaries as much anymore. You may allow a message to remain unanswered until you actually know what you want to say. You may hear something that once triggered an immediate reaction and decide that it does not deserve your energy. Your silence is no longer filled with the hope that they will notice. It is filled with discernment. And they can feel the difference. The fear of replacement may be present, but not only in a romantic sense. They may fear that healthier routines have replaced the waiting, that stronger support has replaced the emotional isolation, that your own judgment has replaced the need for their approval. What they are losing is not ownership of you. It is automatic access to you. This person may be realizing that they cannot return casually, offer the same vague explanation, and expect to meet the version of you who once made room before asking whether they had earned it. You are more selective now. Not cruel, not closed, just awake to what inconsistency costs you. The reversed Four of Swords shows that this realization may be disturbing the comfort of their avoidance. The truth reached them just as the silence began becoming permanent in a way they did not expect. And just in time does not mean they control what happens next. It means honesty may still matter, but only if it arrives before you stop needing anything from the conversation. That is the pressure building now, because what they do next will reveal whether they truly understand what they lost, or whether they are simply afraid that they can no longer influence you. And that difference will show itself in what they are willing to name. This Nine of Pentacles reversed reflects the discomfort of realizing that confidence, independence, or emotional security may have been more fragile than it appeared. Psychologically, it can describe someone who seemed self-contained while quietly depending on your attention to confirm that they still mattered. So they may return with nostalgia before they return with honesty. They may mention a memory, test whether you are still warm toward them, or send something indirect that gives them room to retreat if your response is not what they hoped for. They may ask how you have been without acknowledging why they lost access to that part of your life. Or they may speak about missing you while avoiding the choices that made your absence necessary. That is urgency. But urgency is not always accountability. Missing the comfort you provided is different from understanding the confusion you carried. Wanting reassurance that you still care is different from accepting that your care was repeatedly placed in an unsafe position. And here is where you will notice the change, if there is one. Authentic accountability does not require you to decode it. This person would be able to name what they misunderstood. They would acknowledge that your distance had a history. They would speak about your experience without immediately defending their intentions or asking you to make their guilt easier to hold. They would also accept that your boundaries are not revenge. They are information. The reversed Nine of Pentacles suggests that this person may be confronting how much of their emotional confidence depended on believing you would remain available. Now they have to decide whether they want connection or simply relief from the feeling of being left behind. You do not need to become cold to recognize that difference. You can care and still require clarity. You can listen without reopening every door. You can understand their fear without allowing that fear to become your responsibility again. And the balance between you has already changed. They may finally be preparing to say what you once needed to hear, but you are no longer waiting in the same emotional position to receive it. That means the conversation they imagined is no longer possible. They may arrive expecting access to your softness. Instead, they are going to meet your standards. And that meeting may not happen in the way they expected. This Eight of Swords reversed reflects the moment when someone begins recognizing that the trap was partly maintained by fear, avoidance, and the belief that nothing could change. Psychologically, it speaks about release from a pattern that once felt impossible to challenge. For a long time, the ambiguity may have worked in their favor. They could remain close without defining the connection. They could disappear without fully ending it. They could offer enough emotion to keep you engaged while withholding the clarity that would have required them to become accountable. But those rules no longer protect them. Whether this becomes a direct conversation, a message, a change in behavior, or a silence they can no longer misinterpret, the emotional structure is the same. This person may approach believing you will explain yourself again. They may expect you to reassure them that your feelings are still there, soften the past, or prove that they still have a place in your life. And they may be surprised by how little you need to prove. Because delayed recognition does not erase delayed effort. Withheld praise does not suddenly repair the moments when you were made to feel ordinary. And understanding your value after losing access to it does not automatically restore the access. This is where the wounded pride begins meeting reality. The person who once controlled the uncertainty may now be the one asking what you feel, where they stand, or whether there is still a chance to speak honestly. They may want certainty from you after leaving you to survive without it. That reversal matters. You have already learned that mixed signals are not a substitute for intimacy. You have learned that someone caring privately does not excuse them from behaving carelessly. And most importantly, you have learned how to remain connected to yourself, even when another person refuses to offer answers. The reversed Eight of Swords shows that you are no longer trapped inside the need for their approval. So when this moment arrives, you may not react from the old wound. You may listen. You may ask a direct question. You may require them to finish the sentence they once avoided. Or you may decide that silence is the clearest answer available. Because what changes everything is not simply what they finally say. It is what you are no longer afraid to say back. And what you say back may be much simpler than they expected. This Eight of Cups reversed reflects the difficulty of returning to something that was never fully resolved. Psychologically, it speaks about unfinished emotion, the pull of familiar patterns, and the moment someone must decide whether they are returning to repair what happened or merely repeating it. You may no longer give them a long explanation of your pain. You may not list every moment that hurt, defend every boundary, or search for the perfect words that will finally make them understand. You have already spent enough time translating your experience for someone who benefited from misunderstanding it, so your response may be calm. You may tell them that care was never the issue. Consistency was. You may acknowledge that the connection mattered without pretending the uncertainty was acceptable. You may allow them to feel the discomfort of what happened without immediately rushing in to reassure them that they are still a good person. That is not cruelty. That is emotional honesty. For a long time, the connection may have depended on you carrying more than your share. You carried the questions, the hope, the explanations, and sometimes even the responsibility for repairing damage you did not create. They could remain uncertain because you kept trying to create certainty for both of you. But you are not doing that anymore. And that is why everything changes. Whether this person becomes more accountable or whether you decide that the connection has reached its limit, the old arrangement cannot continue. You cannot return to accepting fragments simply because they arrive with emotion. You cannot confuse regret with change or recognition with readiness. The reversed Eight of Cups also reveals something unexpected. The truth may have arrived just in time, not only because there is still an opportunity for honesty between you two, but because you were close to carrying this same pattern into another connection. Waiting. Over-explaining. Mistaking emotional intensity for emotional availability. Now you can recognize it. You can care without abandoning yourself. You can remain open without becoming endlessly accessible. And you can hear what this person has to say without allowing their answer to determine your worth. So the truth is finally visible. But now comes the final question. What would genuine resolution actually require from both of you? Genuine resolution would require both of you to stop treating uncertainty as though it were the connection itself. This Two of Pentacles reflects the effort of trying to hold competing priorities, emotions, and responsibilities without allowing any of them to fall. Psychologically, it speaks about adaptation, balance, and the difference between managing a difficult situation and endlessly adjusting to someone else's inconsistency. For this person, resolution would require more than admitting they were wrong about you. They would need to show that the truth has changed how they behave. Not for a few emotional days, not only when they feel afraid of losing you, consistently. They would have to understand that you were never indifferent. You were overwhelmed by carrying a connection that kept asking you to remain emotionally available without offering the same security in return. You were not manipulating them by becoming quiet. You were protecting what remained after too much uncertainty had been placed in your hands, and you were never impossible to love. You simply became unwilling to make love easier for someone who kept making honesty difficult for you. The Two of Pentacles also reflects the choice in front of you now. This connection may be rebuilt, but only through actions that create balance where there was once emotional imbalance. That would mean accountability continuing after the immediate fear passes. Clear communication replacing mixed signals. Effort becoming something you can rely on rather than something you have to interpret. Or this truth may serve a different purpose. It may release you from the belief that you needed their recognition in order to prove that what you felt was real. It may allow you to move forward without continuing to question whether you asked for too much, cared too deeply, or misunderstood your own experience. The reversed Six of Wands began this message with delayed recognition. And now that recognition is arriving after you stopped organizing your worth around receiving it. That is the final reversal. Yes, it matters that this person finally sees what happened. It matters that the story they told themselves can no longer remain untouched. But the greater change is happening within you. You already know what you gave. You already know why you left. And everything changes between you because the truth arrived just in time, but you decide what it is allowed to change.